The conference room smelled like stale coffee and carpet cleaner. Jackson Browne sat at the end of a long table, hands folded in front of him, looking at faces he'd seen before but never really knew. Record label executives, marketing directors, radio consultants, people in suits who spoke in percentages and demographics and market share. They'd been talking for 20 minutes. Jackson hadn't said much, just listened, watched their mouths move, heard the words without really hearing them. The man at the head of the table, gray hair, expensive watch, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes, was mid-sentence when he paused and looked directly at Jackson. "So, what do you think? Can we make this work?" Jackson blinked, realized everyone was looking at him, waiting. He glanced down at the papers spread across the table. Charts, graphs, data he didn't understand and didn't care to. They'd been explaining something about format changes, about what radio stations needed, about how the landscape was shifting, and if he wanted to stay relevant, he'd have to shift with it. "Make what work?" Jackson asked. The man's smile tightened, the adjustments to the new material. "We're not asking you to change who you are, just soften some of the edges, make it more accessible." Jackson leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. "Soften which edges?" Another executive, younger, eager, jumped in. "The political stuff, the social commentary. It's great, don't get me wrong, but radio is moving toward something lighter, something people can turn on in their cars without feeling like they're being lectured to." "I'm not lecturing anyone," Jackson said quietly. "Of course not. But that's how it can come across. And the programmers, they're under pressure too. Advertisers want safe. They want feel-good. They want songs people can sing along to without thinking too hard." Jackson looked around the room, saw heads nodding, saw people who believed what they were saying, people who weren't trying to hurt him or sabotage him. They were just doing their jobs, trying to sell records, trying to keep the machine running, and he was part of that machine, or at least he was supposed to be. "What if I don't want to soften it?" he asked. The room went quiet, not the uncomfortable kind, just the kind where everyone suddenly had to recalibrate. The man with the gray hair set down his pen, folded his hands, took a breath. "Then we're going to have a problem," he said, not unkindly, just factual. "Radio is changing, Jackson. The stations that used to play your stuff, they're getting new ownership, new formats. They're moving toward top 40, toward what's safe and tested. If your music doesn't fit that mold, they're not going to play it. And if they don't play it, people don't hear it. And if people don't hear it..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Jackson stood up, not angrily, just slowly, deliberately. "I appreciate the meeting," he said, "but I'm not changing the songs." He walked out before anyone could respond, down the hall, through the lobby, out into the Los Angeles afternoon where the sun was too bright and the air tasted like exhaust. He got in his car and sat there for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. It wasn't the first time he'd had that conversation. And he knew it wouldn't be the last. The album he'd just finished was different from the others, rawer, more direct. It talked about things people didn't want to talk about: nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, economic inequality, the way systems crushed people while everyone looked the other way. He'd written the songs because he had to, because staying silent felt like complicity, because music, for him, had never been just about entertainment. It was about truth, about holding up a mirror and forcing people to look at what they'd been ignoring. But truth didn't fit neatly into 3.5-minute radio slots. Truth didn't test well with focus groups. Truth made advertisers nervous. The first single came out. It got some attention. A few independent stations played it. College radio picked it up. But the big stations, the ones that mattered, the ones that reached millions, stayed quiet. His manager started getting calls, polite calls, apologetic calls, calls that all said the same thing in different ways. We love Jackson, but this just isn't the right fit for our format right now. He tried to ignore it, told himself it didn't matter, that the people who needed to hear the songs would find them, but deep down he knew it did matter. Because music didn't exist in a vacuum. It needed ears. It needed voices singing along. It needed to move through the world and touch people and change something, even if that something was small. Weeks passed. Then months. The album came out to good reviews. Critics praised it, called it brave, important, necessary. But brave didn't sell records. Important didn't get you on the radio. Necessary didn't fill seats at concerts. Sales were sluggish. Tour dates got canceled. Not all of them. But enough that Jackson started to notice. Enough that his manager started having different conversations with them. Conversations that began with "we need to talk about the direction" and ended with Jackson saying no. One night, after a show in a half-empty venue in the Midwest, Jackson sat backstage with his guitar tech, a guy named Ray who'd been with him for years. Ray was packing up cables, moving slowly, deliberately, like he had something on his mind but didn't know how to say it. "You okay?" Jackson asked. Ray looked up, shrugged. "Yeah. Just, I heard some of the crew talking." "About what?" "About whether there's going to be more dates. Whether this is the last run." Jackson didn't say anything. Just sat there, guitar across his lap, fingers moving over strings he wasn't really playing. "Is it true?" Ray asked. "What they're saying on the radio?" "What are they saying?" "That you're too political now. That you've lost touch. That you're preaching instead of playing." Jackson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, that's what they're saying." Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, I think they're full of shit." Jackson looked at him. "Why?" "Because the songs matter. Because people need to hear them, even if they don't want to. What if they just stop listening?" Ray shrugged. "Then they stop listening. But at least you said something. At least you didn't pretend everything was fine when it wasn't." Jackson thought about that. Thought about all the times he'd sat down to write and felt the pull between what was true and what was safe, between saying something that mattered and saying something that would sell. He'd always chosen truth, even when it cost him, even when it made things harder, because the alternative, pretending, softening, hiding, felt like dying in slow motion. But sitting there in that empty venue, he wondered if Ray was right, if saying something was enough, or if it only mattered if someone was listening. The next morning he got a call from his manager. Another station had dropped him from rotation. A major one. One of the last holdouts. The manager tried to spin it positively, talked about new opportunities, about independent distribution, about building a loyal base instead of chasing mainstream success. Jackson listened, thanked him, hung up. He thought about the meeting in the conference room, about the man with the gray hair and the expensive watch, about the question, "Can we make this work?" And he realized the answer had always been no. Not because he was stubborn or self-destructive or trying to prove a point, but because making it work meant becoming someone he wasn't. Meant writing songs he didn't believe in, meant trading truth for access. And he couldn't do that. Wouldn't do that, even if it meant the doors kept closing. Over the next year, more doors closed. Stations that used to play him moved to different formats. Program directors who used to call stopped calling. The industry moved on, chased new sounds, new voices. Artists who fit the mold, who made things easy, who didn't ask uncomfortable questions or demand that listeners think. Jackson kept writing, kept playing, not in arenas anymore. Not in sold-out theaters, but in smaller rooms, college campuses, community centers, places where people came because they wanted to hear what he had to say, not because the radio told them to. And something strange happened. The crowds got smaller, but they got more present, more engaged. People didn't just listen, they leaned in, they asked questions afterward, they told him the songs mattered. That they'd been waiting for someone to say the things he was saying, that they felt less alone knowing someone else saw what they saw, felt what they felt. One night, after a show in a small venue in Northern California, a young woman approached him. She was maybe 22, nervous, holding a worn notebook against her chest like a shield. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. Jackson smiled. For what? For not giving up. For keeping going even when no one's playing your stuff on the radio. How do you know no one's playing it? She laughed. "Because I've been looking. I've been trying to find your new album on the stations I used to listen to. But they won't play it. They play the old stuff sometimes. The safe stuff. But not the new things. Not the things that matter." Jackson felt something tighten in his chest. "Does it bother you that they won't play it?" She thought about it. "Yeah. But not because I can't hear it. I found it anyway. It bothers me because I think about all the people who won't, who'll just keep listening to whatever the radio tells them to listen to, who'll never know that someone out there is trying to tell the truth." Jackson nodded slowly. "So what do we do about that?" She shrugged. "I don't know. Keep telling the truth, I guess. Keep making the songs. And hope that eventually enough people hear them that it doesn't matter whether the radio plays them or not." She thanked him again and walked away. Jackson stood there, watching her disappear into the crowd, and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not hope, exactly, but something close. A sense that maybe the doors closing weren't the end, maybe they were just clearing space for something different, something smaller but more real. He thought about his early days, before the record deals and the radio play and the expectations, when he'd played to rooms of 15 people who came because they loved music, not because they knew his name. Back then, every song felt like a conversation. Every performance felt like a shared secret. There was something pure about it, something that got lost when the rooms got bigger and the stakes got higher. Now, standing in this small venue with maybe 100 people scattered through the space, he felt that purity again, not because he'd chosen it, but because it had chosen him. Because refusing to soften his message had led him back to the beginning, back to the people who cared about the words more than the production, who valued truth more than polish. His manager called the next week, said they needed to have a serious conversation about the future, about whether it made sense to keep touring at this level, about whether Jackson should consider taking a break. Reassessing, maybe writing something more commercial, something that could get him back on the radio. Jackson listened to all of it. Then he said, "I'm not taking a break, and I'm not changing what I write." There was a long silence on the other end. Then his manager sighed. "Okay, then we do it your way. But you need to understand this is going to be hard. The money won't be what it was. The venues will be smaller. Some people are going to say you're finished." "Let them say it," Jackson replied. Another silence. Then, quieter, "Why, Jackson? Why does it have to be this way?" Jackson thought about the question, about all the easy answers he could give. But none of them felt true. Finally, he said, "Because if I stop saying what I need to say, I stopped being who I am. And I'd rather play small rooms as myself than fill arenas as someone else. Years passed. The industry kept changing. Radio became less important. New technologies emerged, ways for people to find music without gatekeepers, without program directors deciding what was acceptable and what wasn't. Jackson's audience grew again, not to what it had been, but enough to keep going, enough to matter. He never softened his message, never wrote the safe songs, never traded truth for airplay. And the cost of that choice was real. He lost opportunities, lost money, lost the kind of fame that comes with being played everywhere all the time. But he gained something too, something harder to measure but more valuable. He gained integrity, respect, a body of work that stood for something, that meant something, that people came back to not because it was catchy or easy, but because it was true. One afternoon, years later, he was walking through a record store, one of the few that still existed. A teenager was browsing the racks, pulled out one of Jackson's albums, the one the radio stations had refused to play, the one that had closed so many doors. The kid looked at it, read the back, put it under his arm, and kept browsing. Jackson almost said something, almost walked over and introduced himself. But he didn't. He just watched the kid carry the album to the counter, watched him pay for it, watched him walk out into the afternoon with the record tucked under his arm like it mattered. And Jackson thought about all the doors that had closed, about all the stations that had said no, about all the meetings where people had told him to soften his message to make it easier to fit the mold. He thought about the choice he'd made, the choice to keep saying what needed to be said even when no one wanted to hear it, even when it cost him everything the industry had promised. And standing there in that quiet record store with dust floating in the afternoon light, Jackson realized something he couldn't have known back then, sitting in that conference room with executives who spoke in percentages and demographics. He realized that the doors closing weren't punishment. They were clarity. They were the world showing him who he was and what he stood for. They were the price of meaning something. Not everyone would hear the songs, not everyone would understand, not everyone would care. But the ones who did, the young woman with the notebook, the teenager in the record store, the people in the small venues who leaned in and listened like their lives depended on it, those people mattered more than all the radio stations in the world. Jackson left the store, walked out into the street where the sun was setting and the city was loud with life. He thought about the next song, the next album, the next thing he needed to say. And he knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't soften it, wouldn't make it easier, wouldn't trade truth for access. Because some doors were supposed to close, some spaces weren't meant for everyone, and the cost of walking through the wrong doors was losing yourself in rooms that were never yours to begin with. He got in his car, started the engine, and drove home through the fading light, carrying the weight of every closed door and every choice that led to them, knowing that he'd make the same choices again. Not because he was brave, not because he was righteous, not because he had all the answers, but because staying silent, softening the message, pretending everything was fine, that would have been a different kind of death. The kind you don't come back from. The kind that erases you from the inside out until nothing's left but the hollow shell of who you used to be. And Jackson Browne, driving through the city as the day turned to night, chose to stay whole, even if it meant staying small, even if it meant the radio stations never opened their doors again. Because the doors that mattered, the ones that led to truth, to meaning, to songs that actually said something, those doors were still open. And he was still walking through them.